Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is actually my third time with the honor of speaking to the elephants, because I remember the second time Bishop Gumbleton said, this is the second time. And I made the most idiotic comment I have ever made in public or in private, almost. I'm glad my wife's not here to check that. When I said to the elephants group that I thought the culture wars were almost over. I thought we're all done with this silliness and we're all going to agree to be tolerant and we have important things to get done and stop bickering and fighting. Lo and behold, we're back, the vengeance culture wars. So I'm free to make mistakes here because I know that I'll recover. And it is very nice to be here. And the good thing is I say very few things that are actually interesting. So you'll forget all of it. And that the good thing is that you'll never get sick of me if I keep coming back, because you won't remember a thing that I've said. But so the task assigned to me is to talk about Trump policies and practices from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. I thought it was Catholic social teaching, and I just see Catholic social justice here. I am not a very attentive person, but I do talk about justice because I think justice is central to Catholic social teaching, so it'll work. What I'd like to do in the next 4 hours is talk about a little introduction and caveats and the key 4 moral principles of Catholic social teaching, and then specifically focus on justice and mercy as essential. Because I think you can't just talk about justice in Catholic social teaching. You have to talk about mercy, and they're interdependent. Justice by itself is cold and aloof and impartial. Mercy is the tenderness in the heart, but if you don't have mercy without justice, you have sentimentalism. So we need both. And then I'll talk about Catholic social teaching and Trump administration policies and practices. We could be here for a year and talk about this topic. So I'm going to focus on immigration and cut to foreign aid as a window into, I think, a problem that runs throughout these policies and practices, which is, I would say fundamentally, there is no sense of the dignity of the human person. That's why I think if I'm going to say the core of the core, that's it. And then we'll talk about specifically J.D. Vance, who's a Catholic convert, and sees a Catholic justification for these Trump administration practices and policies. So I want to focus on the justification. It makes it a little more interesting, I think. My worry about this talk is it's going to be boring because I'm preaching to the choir. And I feel like when I come to the elephants, I feel like you are my people. And in the back of my mind, the first thing I think is, baby boomers of the world unite. That's I feel like I wish my wife were here to enjoy this because she's one of us. And then some concluding challenges. So the questions are, the first question I want to ask that came up in the prayer, which I think beautifully fits into what I'm going to try to talk about, is how do we as Catholics best approximate fidelity to the gospel in our own context, in the situation we face ourselves with, or we're faced with. And this leads to 2 sub-questions. What do we think is going on today? What is going on today? That's a descriptive question. How do we interpret the signs of the times in light of the gospel? Brought up today, Tom talked about Gaudium et Spes and that famous beginning of the task of being a Christian today and a church today. Thirdly, how should we respond to what's going on? How do we respond? What do we do? It's not enough to just sit back and evaluate, but what do we do given the situation? And this, I think Catholic social teaching provide a framework of Christian and human standards. You don't have to be Christian to think Catholic social teaching has a lot to say. In fact, many of my students that are raised with nothing, see, I really like Catholic social teaching. I like the norms. I like the standards. I like the way they care about people. I just don't like the church because they don't live up to it. And I don't see that to blame the hierarchy, although they've got their share. I think we all need to live up to the standards. And we all have the duty to testify to those values by the way we lead our lives. So I'm not trying to throw stones at the clergy at all. So it gives us a framework of standards that can help us answer two questions. One question, how should we morally evaluate the policies and practices of the Trump administration in light of Catholic social teaching? And then secondly, what do we do about that, okay? So my caveat is I'm just a Catholic moral theologian, rather than a policy analyst or a political scientist, let alone a pundit. I'm just a guy who teaches religion, basically. But I do care a lot about social justice. A lot of things in my life have reinforced that from the time I was a young high school kid at Bellarmine High School, a Jesuit school in San Jose, where the seeds were really laid for me and were watered at Gonzaga and by my friendships and my work at Boston College. But I want to say that even though I'm not a pundit or something, an expert, the challenges we face are too important to be left to the experts. These are things we should all be thinking about. My goal here is to help us think through together how the values and standards of Catholic social teaching help us interpret, evaluate, and respond to the Trump administration's policies and practices. This reflection is not meant to take sides in a partisan political contest between Republicans and Democrats. Plenty of people are doing that. And criticism of the Republicans doesn't mean I endorse what the Democrats propose as an alternative. And I think this is a prophetic task. That the prophetic task is we have to call a spade and look at what is the predominant form of, I would say, injustice in our society right now. So I've been asked to focus on the administration's policies and practices rather than denounce the personal moral flaws of Donald Trump and his close allies. Go to Instagram if you want to see plenty of that. You don't need me for that. But this is not a clear-cut task because the policies and practices of the administration really reflect the values and worldview of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. You can't just peel them apart as if they're not related. So I'm very skeptical of people that say, I don't like him, but I like his policies. I think that's an abstraction that is a form of mental gymnastics. So the topic is vast. Lastly, my last caveat, the topic is vast, so my treatment will have to be somewhat superficial given the time we have. There's a lot to say, and I can't say most of it, and there's a lot you could say. And I hope in the Q&A we can surface some of the things that I have to buzz by, because I'm kind of flying at 40,000 feet. Don't have time to get into all the details, but we can go into what you want to go into. So the first thing I want to think about is what does Catholicism, Catholic social teaching, have to do with the public world that we're in? And this is really going back to the distinction Tom made between Christianity about saving your soul, which I called the theology of geography. It's a change of location. Versus Christianity is about transforming the world, the Spirit transforming the world, and we're on board with the Spirit. So I think if you take transforming the world, a significant part of our religious identity, not a sideshow for politics that's not relevant, but central to the gospel. Jesus says, I come to bring life and bring it abundantly. He didn't say, I came to give you an exit strategy. I bring life and bring it abundantly. I think there are four things that Catholic social teaching can do and plays a role in the role of religion in public moral discourse, how we talk together as a society, not only as a church, but with people that are not, sharing our faith commitments. First, Catholic social teaching can help form consciences, can help form our consciences. Sometimes you hear the job is to form consciences. It really means the bishops and priests are forming the consciences of the lay people, but I think we're getting to the point where we're realizing actually lay people help to form the consciences of priests and bishops, especially the priests that are part of this kind of community and Bishop Gumbleton, because they realize we're all learning and teaching. There aren't learners in one thing and teachers are another. Learners are one and teachers are another, one above the other, but there's a lot to figure out, and it's not easy. So to form conscience, to number two, to deliberate together as Catholics about the common good. One of the things I'm sad about with many parishes is they're not communities of discourse. They're not places where people actually talk in an extended way about what really matters. Thirdly, Catholic social teaching can help us deliberate with all people of goodwill about matters of law and public policy on grounds that they can accept by means of dialogue, listening, appeal to the human good that they can recognize, the concrete evidence of what actually helps people and hurts people, what policies actually work and what policies don't work. And then to use reason, to argue together. Let's sit and argue together about what's the best way we can live as a community. And then finally, to shape public consensus. While knowing that sometimes the church, or we as Christians, have to defend values that the wider society does not find persuasive. For example, on capital punishment or on the recourse to the use of lethal violence in war. The Catholic assumption, and this is going way back to St. Augustine and certainly Thomas Aquinas after him, is that people are generally intelligent enough, amenable to reason, and willing to do what's right when properly informed. But here we have a major challenge, of course, because increased polarization, cultural alienation, negative partisanship, where you hate the other one more than you like your own candidate, and animosity within the country pose a challenge to the assumption that voters are open to being persuaded when presented with good reasons and solid evidence. And exhibit A for this is the denial of climate science. Many other forms as well. Election denial is another example. There's no evidence there was a stolen election whatsoever. But people persist. Millions and millions of people persist in insisting that the election was stolen in 2020. So what we have here is we have this big cluster. This reminds me of a tree. This is a list of all the different documents from the church, Catholic social teaching, and then the scriptural roots. It reminds me of a tree that really needs a hedge climber, or really needs a weed whacker. Because how do these go together? It looks like a mess. It looks like spaghetti on your plate that got shifted on the train or something. So I think we can boil this down to 4 key principles. And this has been common about the last 30 years to say these are the primary 4 principles. First, human dignity is the intrinsic value of a person created in the image and likeness of God and redeemed by Christ. And that dignity is intrinsic rather than earned. It's given gratuitously by a God who loves us rather than something that we have to perform to get. It's for all people. It's universal, not given to some groups and not others. And it's equal in every person. Every person has equal dignity, which runs exactly against the way our society thinks about what dignity is. The senator has more dignity than the person that's cleaning the toilets. The wealthy person in a CEO of a corporation has more dignity than the immigrant who's working in the kitchen 12 hours a day to feed her family. And in God's eyes, they have the same exact dignity. And we have trouble getting that through our thick head because we live in a very competitive society where there's a lot of people are driven to show that they have worth by what they can accomplish. I think that's the most important principle. Number 2, solidarity, and the rest are really unfolding from dignity. Solidarity refers to the virtue enabling the human family to share fully the treasure of material and spiritual goods. If everybody has dignity, then everybody belongs, and if everybody belongs, everybody should be living a good life. Thirdly, subsidiarity is the coordination of society's activities in a way that supports the internal life of the local communities. In other words, people should be the ones who are the engines, the agency of their own communities. Rather than having it done for them, the ideal of subsidiarity is people do for themselves, and the community provides the resources that help them do for themselves, when they can, if they can. And fourthly, the common good is the totality of social conditions, allowing persons to achieve their communal and individual fulfillment. Now, it's important to see, critically important, I say that these principles all have to go together and they're all interdependent. And if you just take one out, you distort it. So each principle has certain strengths, but also certain liabilities when taken in isolation from the others. And I have examples of where this can go wrong. On the right column here, on the top is General Pinochet, the dictator from Chile. Then there's a flag of the Stasi, who were the Croatian militia that supported the Nazis, that were really Nazis in Croatia during World War II. And then Joseph Tiso, a Slovenian Catholic dictator who was very big on solidarity, but not very big on individual dignity. So the common good without recognition of the dignity of every person becomes either fascism or communism. Solidarity without recognition of the dignity of others becomes exclusive in-group bias or xenophobia. Subsidiarity without the larger common good becomes myopic, parochial, exclusive, and closed in on itself. So each must be interpreted in light of the others. For example, we cannot understand human dignity unless we also see that our dignity is upheld and strengthened by community. In what follows, I will suggest that attempts to use Catholicism to support a Trump administration policies and practices either ignore Catholic social teaching altogether or interpret them very selectively. So that's kind of the thread I want to kind of have you keep in mind as I go through. Excuse me. So in Catholic social teaching, the fundamental notion of justice comes from the Bible, and it's justice as right relationships. That's fundamental, relationship, not individual rights. Rights are derivative of relationships and supportive of relationships. And in the Catholic tradition, true peace is based on right relationships. We hear peace is based on justice. If you don't have justice, whatever peace you think you're creating isn't going to last. It's not really peace. And this is rooted in the Catholic tradition, in the Bible, with Paul's metaphor that we're all different parts of one body. This organic metaphor stresses three kinds of relationships. Parts must be in right relationships to each other. Mom and dad have to be in right relationship with each other. Parts must be in right relationship to the whole. Mom and dad and the kids have to be in right relationship to the family. And then thirdly, the whole must be in right relationship right relationship to every member. So that the family has to be a right relationship to all the individuals in that family. Rather than suppress some or help some at the expense of others, pay attention to some and not others. You see what havoc that runs in families when that happens over a long period of time. Social justice concerns how all three forms of justice, as Paul puts it, social justice concerns how all three forms of justice must ensure justice to the least advantaged members of the community. If one of the kids has an ear infection, that's the attention you're going to get, and that's why God made that kid scream like a banshee, or evolution, or both. But you pay attention to the one who's hurting. It doesn't mean you don't love the others just as much, but it means that's the urgent need that you have to address. Caring about people who are victims of racist injustice doesn't mean you don't care about other people. Bless you. But it does mean that they need your attention right now, given the crisis situation that we're looking at. So solidarity and compassion are the marks of social justice in the Catholic tradition. As Paul puts it, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Isn't that a beautiful, I love that line from Paul. If one member suffers, all suffer. So think about this. How can we not suffer when our brothers and sisters in inner city Detroit aren't getting rehab beds to help them with their addiction recovery? How can we not suffer when people in prison are in there under very harsh conditions that are unfair and destructive of their well-being? So justice, solidarity, and compassion demand that we respect the human rights of everyone, especially those most deprived of their rights. And this is reaffirmed many times in church teachings. I want to stress that what's distinctive of Catholic social teaching from the beginning is a recognition that justice isn't just a virtue of individuals or communities. It's also a virtue of institutions. And that evil can be perpetrated by institutions run by good people who do not know what they're doing is hurting people by the way that they run their institutions. So Benedict XVI says, it is necessary not only to relieve the gravest needs, but to go to their roots, proposing measures that will give social and political economic structures a more equitable and solidaristic configuration. And by this, he's talking about the preferential option for the poor. Now, it would be no fun not to note at least that there are some voices in the Catholic Church and elsewhere in Christianity that are strongly opposed to social justice, or at least very skeptical of it. One of the milder versions of this skepticism is from Bishop Robert Barron. You may have heard of him. And his worry is that not that social justice is bankrupt or illegitimate, but that it crowds out more important religious concerns. So his view is, let's not focus so much on social justice. Let's get back to saving souls. So here's his worry, and I read this as a college professor for 37 years, dealing with students from all over the map, including those that are very fired up, as I said, by Catholic social teaching, and they're working in the soup kitchens, and they're working in prison ministry, and just fantastic people. Most of them had priests or nuns if they were in the 1950s. But it's not, and they're not. So he complains that young people today applaud that the church advocates for justice, even as they profess little or no belief in God, Jesus' resurrection, Bible as an inspired text, or life after death. I would argue that this disconnect is at least in part a result of the hyper-stress that we have placed on social justice in the years following the Council. I wish I had time to respond to this, because I think he's got it backwards. I think that the witness of the church to social justice is actually what makes young people think, hey, you know, the church isn't all that bad. I hate what they say about gays. I hate the way they treat women. But you know, if they can do that in the inner city, if they can be with refugees in Uganda, maybe they got something going. But Barron's worry is that if you talk a lot about social justice, you're not talking about faith. And I think that's an odd dichotomy. Now, a little more harsh, Glenn Beck. You heard him, I guess, from the Moans. He says, I beg you, look for the word social justice or economic justice on your church website. If you find it, run as fast as you can. Social justice and economic justice, they are code words. And he means code words for people that are either Nazis or communists. He says that. Later on, his editor said, no, he doesn't really mean that. What he means is he's all in favor of charity, but doesn't want justice. Again, you're dichotomizing, right? That's taking you in the wrong direction, because for him, charity is about individual action. Justice is about sometimes redistributing wealth from those who have from those who don't have. And that's what he hates. So we get Mike Pence, an evangelical Christian. Social justice is merely secular. He says the church is to be a force for bringing people to Christ, preaching the gospel, saving souls. I miss the first days of the church. It's like he was a 2,000-year-old guy. I miss those first days of the church where the priority was just to preach the gospel. The purest, most honest form of Christianity, simple witnessing. We didn't care for building schools or hospitals then, just ensuring people had an eternity with God after this life. I guess he didn't read the whole Bible, because Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4 say people brought whatever they had to the community and they took from whatever they needed. It didn't say they have a building that they've set up and a franchise in order to deliver food, because people actually were sharing with each other. But that actually led to Catholic institutions like hospitals. So that you need institutions in which people can give from what they have to support the hospitals, and they can take what they need when they need medical care. Lastly, J.D. Vance, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more, refers to social justice as a radical left form of bias and cheating that gives self-styled oppressed groups priority over the rights of hardworking Americans. I won't comment on that. I don't need to with your rumblings. The murmuring in the desert that Moses talked about. So love is the basis of both mercy and justice. Mercy is love toward those who suffer. Justice is love giving to those for whom something is due what is due to them. And Francis, the main theme of his pontificate really, I would say, is mercy. Mercy, compassion, tenderness. He couldn't say enough of that. And as I age, I just turned 70, I am more and more convinced that Elon Musk could not be more wrong when he says what's really wrong with the United States is we have too much empathy. I don't think we've scratched the surface on empathy or on compassion. But that mercy has to give rise to institutional commitment. So these are the 2 feet of love in action. Or the foot is the foot of social justice and the foot of charitable works. And one should not be pitted against the other. You just read a really nice litany of all the different kind of ways we think about human rights. Political rights, economic rights. And these rights in the Catholic tradition since John the 23rd, died in 1963, wrote beautiful encyclicals, Mater Magistra, Pacem in Terris, saying that rights, enforcement of rights, respect for rights is the key to justice in a society. And I think that was picked up in Vatican II and developed by the fathers of Vatican II. And in Paul VI, you have this notion of integral human development. So integral human development includes the right to life, freedom, the necessities of life such as food, water, clothing, shelter, medicine, and the goods that facilitate leading a full life, such as education, culture, employment, medical, dental, and mental health care, and property. So the Catholic integral human development means we're not aiming at just survival, although that has to be a start. But what is it? How do we organize our community so that everyone has a chance to live a truly flourishing, dignified life, so that they can get up in the mirror and look at themselves and say, I like the life I live, and I'm proud of the person that I am. And how many people can't say that? Many, many millions of people can't say that. So here's on one slide what I think is the essential social ethical vision of contemporary Catholic social teaching. By contemporary, I mean since 1960. Since Pope John the 23rd, Catholic social teaching has strongly supported broadly liberal democratic political principles combined with broadly social welfare market economic policies. When I say liberal here, I don't mean Teddy Kennedy or AOC. I mean John Locke, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, that classical sense of liberal, emphasizing the freedom. Society, the best society is the one that leaves us most secure but also most free to live the lives we would like to live. Catholic social teaching judges this broad political economic framework as generally more in keeping with the values of the gospel than the alternatives. Properly interpreted, human dignity is best promoted in one, political arrangements that allow citizens freely to determine, directly or indirectly, the laws and policies under which they must live. And two, economic arrangements that enable them freely to participate in the economic life of their society when making decisions about the production and distribution of goods and services. The key word is participation. To be participants, you have to be empowered. And to be empowered, you have to have a context, a condition, a community, a framework that allows you to develop your talents and energy and agency. Because individualism runs the risk of determining the common good, undermining the common good, this Western ideal requires a strong commitment to social welfare measures that both enable people to enjoy a decent standard of living, a safety net a safety net that catches everyone and doesn't let people drop through huge holes, and that facilitate their ability to act as agents in their own lives. Competition and free markets can be very useful elements of economic systems. But market forces do not regularly meet the needs of millions of people in this country, let alone in the world. And they do not automatically produce distributive justice in distribution of goods and services. If the private sector does not provide opportunities that enable people to meet their basic needs, then the state must intervene. This is Catholic social teaching. This is an important element of the principle of subsidiarity. The solution to a problem must be found at the most appropriate level. If the market doesn't solve the problem, we have to use human institutions to solve the problem as much as needed, but not more than needed. This also exemplifies solidarity. Laws and policies that reflect that we are one society, one people, and that no one should be discarded. You recognize that as a big theme from Pope Francis, that people are not to be thrown away like our used egg cartons and orange juice cartons. I think today, this is my emphasis, but we can't go into this here because I want to get back to the Trump stuff. But today's severe economic inequality and extreme wealth concentration violate all four principles of Catholic social teaching. The richest 1% now owns 1/3 of all U.S. wealth, while the middle class is shrinking and low-income households are stuck. So Catholic social teaching here emphasizes the importance of prudence, the virtue of practical wisdom, practical decision-making. That sound principles and moral concern, which is what you get from Catholic social teaching, confer neither practical skill nor technical expertise. So Catholic social teaching can't give us a blueprint of what we should do in our society in Detroit in 2025 or Boston 2025. That's what we have to do. Take the principles and think, how can we implement them here, given our constraints and our opportunities? So the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Church wisely points out that the Church does not wish to exercise political power. That wasn't always the case. I just came from Ireland, believe me. Or eliminate the freedom of opinion among Catholics regarding contingent questions. What's the best way to get people employed? Those are contingent questions. Instead, it intends, as is its proper function, to instruct and illuminate the consciences of the faithful, particularly those involved in political life, so that their actions may always serve the integral promotion of the human person and common good. So in other words, there's lots of room for disagreement about policy. And that involves empirical matters, and forecasting, and statistical models, and all that stuff has to be debated, and it's kind of go through trial and error experiences and so forth. But what the Church is saying here is we have these principles that really are inviolable, and we have to think about how we implement them. And are we, if you think about juggling these four principles, if we have a way of dealing with these problems in which one or two of the balls is dropped, we're making a big mistake. We've got to go back and gather them up and see how can we do it better. So I want to look now, we talked about justice, we talked about social justice, right relationships, we talked about human rights. And I quoted J.D. Vance as against social justice because he says that. But I think actually he's defending a kind of social justice. But I would call it nationalistic social justice. Here's what I mean. So Vance converted to Catholicism in 2019 and describes himself as having been influenced by Catholic social teaching. He focuses on overcoming the injustice done to members of the working class whom he considers real Americans. Working class, low-income people. He came out of Appalachia. He wrote the Hillbilly Elegy to talk about the immense suffering his family went through, addiction, violence, domestic abuse, you name it. It's a litany of great suffering. Vance's approach, though, is I got up and out, rather than this is the result of structural injustices. That it becomes a morality tale of his heroic overcoming of the odds, rather than an understanding that there are many, many people that don't have the breaks that he got to get out, that don't have his intelligence to go to Yale Law School, for example. So here are some points where I think worth considering. That Catholic social teaching agrees with Vance that every member of the working class deserves a real opportunity to lead a stable life, to have access to productive, life-sustaining employment, to enjoy a rich family life, and to live in healthy, safe communities. Catholic social teaching does not, in principle, rule out reasonable tariffs and tax incentives that encourage the revitalization of domestic manufacturing. Note I put the emphasis on reasonable there. Thirdly, Catholic social teaching is positively sympathetic to Vance's desire to raise the minimum wage, to increase opportunities for workforce training and apprenticeship, and to pass pro-family tax incentives, especially the child tax credit that can help working families. So far, so good. But Catholic social teaching is highly critical of the administration and his own depiction of undocumented immigrants as criminal invaders who are poisoning our blood. That's not his language, that's Trump's, but he supports it. The cruel methods of mass deportation now practiced by ICE, and the severe cutback of slots available to asylum seekers. These are people who are refugees fleeing their homes to save their lives and the lives of their family. Cutback of slots available to asylum seekers from 125,000 in 2025 to 7,500 for next year. And of those, Trump is saying he's going to include 7,000 Afrikaner whites who he says are subject to genocide in South Africa. So let me pan out, now that I've given you a little bit, I've tried to be fair to Vance and Trump implicitly. I'm trying to be fair, but honest about the gap, which I want to talk about now. So Catholic social teaching and the Trump administration, the big picture, to put a lot of discussion into a few words, a lot of potential discussion, I think the Trump administration policies are undermining classical liberal norms in that it is repeatedly eroding respect for the rule of law, for example, by trying to prosecute political enemies, curtailing the exercise of voting rights, dismantling democratic accountability, firing ombudsmen, special inspectors, weakening the separation of powers and the system of checks and balances, curtailing First Amendment rights, etc. I think this is the biggest problem, and Vance's defense of it is also a big problem. The Trump administration is also at odds with Catholic social teaching in significantly dismantling the social welfare safety net. It's pretty clear that the Trump administration wants to undo the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. And I would even say he wants to undo the New Deal. And we see this dismantling of the social welfare net, safety net, in the reduction, in this attempt to reduce access to SNAP, to Medicaid, and the Democrats did not get the ability to have Congress authorize subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. That's going to leave a lot of people without medical care. Millions of people. The U.S. bishops have been largely silent in the face of the administration's erosion of the fundamental principles of our liberal constitutional democracy. Crickets. Contrast can also be drawn between Catholic social teaching and policies and practices found throughout the executive branch, for example, in the departments of war, energy, health and human services, education, justice, including the FBI, etc. So we will focus on, I'm going to focus just on two things, well, three. The insurrection, cut in foreign aid, and then immigration. So the Trump administration's response to the January 6th insurrection violates the essential values underlying Catholic social teaching. Truth is violated by election denial, which played a major role in provoking the mob to attack the Capitol. Secondly, freedom is violated by aggression toward critics of the administration. Thirdly, justice is violated in many ways by pardoning rioters who violently stormed the Capitol and attacked police officers. Fourth, authentic love of the country is violated by hate-filled right-wing nationalism that regards fellow Americans who oppose them as implacable enemies. The second thing that I want to take a look at very briefly, just one slide on this, is the elimination of USAID humanitarian and development assistance. This is personal to me for several reasons. One of which is that my daughter-in-law works for PEPFAR, President Bush's great program on the prevention of transmission of HIV in Africa that experts say probably saved at this point at least 26 million lives. Nonpartisan agreement that it was effective across the board, empirically shown to be effective. And my cousin, besides my daughter-in-law, but my cousin also worked for PEPFAR. She was laid off. My daughter-in-law is furloughed. But last summer, I spent a month in Uganda working with Jesuit Refugee Service with 10 students and a colleague. I saw an incredible amount of good work done by JRS in Uganda from refugees from all over East Africa, especially the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I saw JRS save people's lives by getting them medicine for diabetes, hypertension, giving them medicine for measles, or inoculations for measles, mumps, and rubella. I mean, the work they were doing, incredible. And when the USAID stopped, JRS had to fire 70% of their staff, and the refugees that were going there every day for literacy training, to basic medical care, to rental assistance, they're all gone. And they have nowhere else to go. They're on the streets of Kampala. And I met mothers who had walked 2,000 miles with their children, sexually abused on the way in front of their children. If you can just imagine the horrors, who now have nowhere to go. So I feel this is a horrible, horrible thing. It's an issue of justice. The bottom line of this is that the Trump administration has called for rescinding nearly $9.4 billion in previously appropriated funds. Congress dedicated those funds, and the Trump administration wants them rescinded. Approximately $8.3 billion of this amount was designed for foreign assistance programs. Foreign assistance means emergency aid, clean water. This is for people that get hit by a natural disaster, or for clean water because they don't have any potable water. But also long-term economic development assistance so that they can learn to be self-sustaining in farming mostly. 85% of USAID programs have been eliminated, with the remaining programs a fairly weak version of PEPFAR folded into the State Department. The cuts have disrupted or ended global health programs and led to consequences such as an increase in deaths from diseases like cholera and HIV/AIDS. In response to this, Marco Rubio said, "No children are dying on my watch." David Brooks, in response to Rubio's comment in May of 2025, said this: according to the Boston University folks, I'm from Boston College, so we don't usually quote Boston University, but in this case, According to the Boston University folks, so far 55,000 adults have died of AIDS in the 4 months since Trump was elected. 6,000 children are dead because of what Doge did. That's just PEPFAR, the HIV, ellipsis here. You add them all up, that's 300,000 dead, and we're 4 months in. Now accumulate that over 4 years, and the number of dead grows very high. Think how devastated we were at 9/11 when 3,000 died, 3,000 Americans died. We're talking here about 300,000, and this is just the start. The last is immigration. What time should I stop?
Keep going.
Nobody's passed out yet, I can tell then. So, immigration is the major flashpoint between the American bishops and the Vatican and the American administration. You all know this, you read the paper. I'm very touched by these words of an auxiliary bishop of Washington, D.C., Evelio Menjivar Ayala. And the headline of the story was, U.S. Catholic bishops decry Trump's immigration raids, upending church life. The way that the immigration policies are enforced these days are not only destabilizing the life of a particular immigrant, but whole families, businesses, the life of children, whole communities and neighborhoods. There are whole communities in LA. When you go out in the middle of the day, you won't see anybody out. People are afraid to leave their homes. They're afraid to go to work. So the bishop says, what I'm seeing is in people's eyes is pain and deep confusion. Where do we go from here if we're not welcome? Notice the use of the word we. Not where do they go. Where do we go? For me, it's very personal because I was a stranger and you welcomed me. He crossed the U.S. border illegally in 1990 after leaving his native El Salvador during the country's civil war. Now a U.S. citizen, he became the first Salvadoran bishop in the United States. The president says he's enforcing these policies to make our cities safer, but I want to see for whom? What he's saying, if immigrants, if people are afraid of interacting with law enforcement, with police reporting crimes, obviously they're going to become targets of crimes. I want to point out that these protests come not only from bishops, and there's some very heroic, outspoken bishops, there are many who are not, but also from religious organizations like Maryknoll, religious orders like the Jesuit Sisters of Mercy. I'm sure the Dominican Sisters of Cincinnati have been at it. They've got that creativity and concern. By lay organizations like the Catholic Worker and Catholic schools and universities. So a lot of Catholics, and I don't think that we should think the bishops have a monopoly on being witnesses to justice. They have a role to play, but it's not the only one. And of course, Leo has been very critical. And I love the upper right picture here of Leo when he was just in Peru for the first time. Isn't that something? See his face? He looks like a little kid, like a teenager. But he wasn't, he was an adult. But he's decrying Trump's inhumane treatment of migrants. How did you receive the foreigner? Did you receive him and welcome him or not? I think there's deep reflection that needs to be made about what is happening. Remember, what's going on? It's the first question. His comments come as the Trump administration, this is the newspaper article, Trump administration is working to deport an estimated 13 million illegal immigrants, equating to 4% of the U.S. population. Pope Leo contends that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency is largely targeting people who have lived for years and years and years, but never caused problems. On the contrary, they positively contributed to our society. Just like Pope Francis, Pope Leo is not mincing his words when he criticizes the Trump administration's immigration policy. Pope Francis called Trump's administration policies not Christian. And just last month, Leo accused the administration of inhuman treatment of migrants. In October, he met with two bishops from El Paso. He says, the church cannot remain silent. You stand with me and I stand with you. Or in this case, he rides on the donkey. But I think so much of life is what your experience has been. The views you have, the values you have is all about where you stand and what you've seen in your life and the stories you've heard and the people that you love. And his view of immigration is coming out of loving the people in Peru and not the affluent people. God bless them. But the people living from day to day, hand to mouth, not knowing when they go to bed at night, where they're going to get their daily bread from. I'm not going to go through all these, but I would say on every one of these points, you have a tension or contradiction between Catholic social teaching and what the administration's practices and policies are when it comes to immigration. I'll call a special attention. So one is border enforcement and immorality. The Remain in Mexico policy was done also by Biden. And I was at the border 2 years ago in March, and I crossed from McAllen, Texas into Reynosa, Mexico. And the towns on that border are controlled by the cartels. And there are 2 refugee camps that if the residents stay in there, they're safe. But if they go one step outside, they get kidnapped and very often murdered or women sold into sex trafficking. It's one of the most horrible things I've ever seen. U.S. policy mandates if you're applying for asylum, you have to stay in Mexico. Now they won't even allow that. So I don't know what people there are going to do. But you've heard about the rapid deportation, people being deported to El Salvador and deported to South Sudan. The one that's probably the most disturbing is the deportation of 247 Venezuelans to a notorious prison in El Salvador, where we don't have any information. They can't contact families, and 75% of the people surveyed had no criminal record whatsoever. Half of them were in the country legally. So I think the cruelty is pretty amazing. What do the bishops actually say about immigration? I'm just going to give you 3 lines. Number 1, and this is drawing from this tradition of Catholic social teaching. Number 1, people have the right to migrate to sustain their lives and the lives of their family members. I gather almost everyone in this room came from families that migrated because their families were trying to make a living. Some are migrated because they had to flee for their lives. Number 2, every country has the right to regulate its borders and to control immigration. Does not open borders at all. It's a recognition that every country has limited resources, and how are we going to divide those resources up in a way that's responsible to the citizens as well as responsive to the people that would like to come. And then thirdly, a country has a right and duty to regulate its borders with justice and mercy. The 2 feet, justice and mercy. So a government's regulation of borders and control of immigration must be evaluated in light of the norms of justice and compassion and the principles of human dignity, the common good, solidarity, and the subsidiarity, those 4 principles. I'm going to keep going because I don't want to have people falling asleep. So border regulation and treatment of undocumented immigrants. ICE essentially treats undocumented people as undeserving of rights or services. Many, many, many cases have been documented of people who have been snatched up and put in camps and not given food or water for 24 hours, not given access to a shower for 2 weeks, forced to sleep on concrete floors with no blankets. Conditions that, if you imagine any of us going through, I'd probably last a day. In contrast, and I would say very sharp contrast, Catholic social teaching insists that every person, no matter what they've done, has basic human rights and is entitled to have an ability to meet their basic human needs: food, shelter, clothing, education, and health care. God promises that our judgment will be based on our treatment of the most vulnerable. And a government cannot excuse inhumane treatment of certain persons by claiming that their lack of legal status deprives them of the rights given to them by their Creator. A special category of migrants are refugees who had to flee. And there's international and United States law requires the government to give people asylum hearings when they apply for refugee status. The administration is now just ignoring that law. What it's doing is illegal. Pope Benedict captures, I think, a Catholic approach to our response to refugees. Asylum seekers who fled from persecution, violence, and situations that put their life at risk stand in need of our understanding and welcome, of respect for their human dignity and rights, as well as awareness of their duties. Their suffering pleads with individual states and the international community to adopt attitudes of reciprocal acceptance, overcoming fears and avoiding forms of discrimination, and to make provisions for concrete solidarity also through appropriate structures of hospitality and resettlement programs. All this entails mutual help between the suffering regions and those which already for years have accepted a large number of fleeing people, as well as a greater sharing of responsibility among states. So we've looked at immigration, the cutting off of international aid, and Vance makes the argument that these are very Christian policies. In January 2025, Vance offered a Christian defense of the Trump administration's immigration policy and planned mass deportations, but his reasoning also applied to the Trump administration's elimination of USAID. In an interview with Scott Hannity, he says, as an American leader, but also just as an American citizen, your compassion belongs first to your fellow citizens. That doesn't mean you hate people from outside of your own borders, but there's this old school concept, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor. And then you love your community. And then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. This provoked a firestorm of protest by religious journalists, bishops, theologians, including myself. I wrote an article in America about this along with 100,000 other people because it's so obviously unchristian. Jesus didn't go up to the guy on the road, the Good Samaritan didn't go up on the guy on the road and say, hey, are you one of me, one of my group? Because you're not a fellow citizen. I got a long list of priorities, buddy, you're at the bottom. So Pope Francis writes in a letter to the American bishops, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. The true order of amoris, the order of love, that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds fraternity open to all without exception. A person is a person is a person. The color of their skin, the language they speak, the gender, that's important, but it's not the essential point. Their proximity to you is not the essential point. The Catholic order of love is open, not contractive. Like the heart. When you're a healthy person, your heart opens up to other people. When you're driven by fear, your heart closes down. And a lot of this fear underlying Vance's position, I think, is stoked by social media and conservative talk TV. They terrify people. We have in John the saying, perfect love casts out fear. But perfect fear casts out love. So it's open, not contractive. It's inclusive, not exclusive. It is incompatible with sentiments like one said by J.D. Vance, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other. That's 40 million people who are targeted by the Russian military. So what I point out here is the selective nature of Vance's form of political Catholicism. He speaks, interestingly, I think, of his move into Catholicism as a political conversion. I always thought it was about Jesus. Like, isn't that the guy who says, come follow me? Not the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or any other party? He draws from older CST themes about the right to life of the unborn, the centrality of the family, and the dignity of work. This is Leo XIII, 1891, until Pius XI, 1930-35. That's the social teaching he's drawing from. And I say, wait, excuse me, but those guys kept talking. The church kept learning. It kept creatively growing. But he ignores the subsequent Catholic social teaching's treatment of the broader meaning of the right to life, that the right to life doesn't end at birth. It goes from womb to tomb, as Cardinal Bernardin liked to say. The principle of solidarity and the option for the poor that John Paul II, no liberal guy, made central to his preaching. The complex and changing nature of families and their pastoral care. Families aren't mom, dad, the kids, and a white picket fence anymore. Maybe that's 30% of families, at best. The church has to respond to families as they actually exist in the world. And finally, the church's consistent teaching, which I already stressed, but it's always worth repeating, that the category neighbor includes every human being, both in-group members and out-group members, and not just fellow citizens. So I'm going to get a few more points in, then I'll give you a break and you can come up for air or whatever you're doing. So I think what we see, and you all have seen the videos, Instagram, news clips, they're horrifying of the way ICE is treating people. Honestly, it doesn't feel like our country anymore. These guys show up in balaclavas. I'm in Boston. We had a student who wrote an op-ed piece in the Tufts student newspaper. She was here with a student visa, legally in the country, at one of the top colleges in the country. They came up in a van. 4 guys get out of the van. They put a hood on her and dragged her into the van and then drove off. Not even wearing uniforms. Like, what is this, the mafia? What is this? So I think we have gross violations of human dignity being perpetrated by our government. And you could talk about it as objectification, as humiliation, which people who have been released from ICE say it's a ritual of humiliation from the minute they touch you, of degradation, and of dehumanization. And this is a story in the bottom of a lady who they're going to deport. And she's terrified and her daughter's terrified. And they just found her in a building. Now here's a challenge. I've only got a couple slides left. Can Catholic social teaching be relevant to this? Or are these just nice ideas floating up in the sky of theologians and bishops and a few, DREs somewhere talking about nice, topics for kids in high schools to write essays on, but does it really make a difference? Can it make a difference? First of all, I do think CST gives us a language for protesting and witnessing. Protest is important if it's intelligent and if it's intelligible. Just out and screaming at the ocean doesn't help anybody. But how do you protest in a way that's heard, that's dignified, that's articulate? So one fundamental problem is we have a lack of education about CST, that most Catholics know almost nothing about it. They seem to reduce Catholic morality to the ban on abortion, ban on sex outside of marriage, and ban on gay marriage. When I teach college students, that's what they think Catholicism means for morality. And they're very happy to know there's a whole lot more on that mountain than this little valley. But they're shocked. In fact, I had one student say, I gave a lecture on love as the center of Catholic ethics. And she says, does the bishop know you think this? You're teaching this at BC? Like, does the archbishop know about this? Like, would BC be okay if you knew this? I said, I'm really going with Jesus on this, but I think they're okay. Now, sociologically, political and cultural identity is often, and I would say usually, more important than a person's religious identity. That people identify with religion X because it aligns with their political allegiance, their sense of what people they belong to believe. Groupthink is endemic to the way human beings operate as moral agents. In our culture, young people often find out that when someone is a churchgoer, whether Protestant or Catholic, they automatically assume that means he or she is Republican. And conservative, although I think that word conservative doesn't work anymore. Because you conserve what's good. You don't bulldoze it. But they think it means small government, strong military, restrictive immigration, climate skepticism, anti-woke, pro-prayer in schools, abortion ban, patriarchal marriage and family, etc. When they do know something about Catholic teaching, Catholic clergy and laity are deeply divided within and between themselves. That's another challenge. And I think even here, religious and political identity shapes what aspects of Catholic teaching and the gospel they really think matters. And in many ways, it would be worthwhile exploring, but I think it's true, we really have competing views of who Jesus is and the kind of community he founded and wants us to be part of. Somebody was just telling me that a pastor came into a church here some time ago and took down the sign, "All are welcome." It's like, what kind of Jesus are you thinking of? Like the Pharisees and scribes criticized him for dining with tax collectors and sinners. Like, shouldn't we have that on the side of the church? Come here if you're a tax collector and a sinner. Yeah. You can free food for tax collectors and sinners? Come on. 2 slides left. Hang on. But these 3 slides are really interesting to me. First of all, bottom right, contributions by Catholic clergy, 21 to 25, evenly split between donations to Democrats and donations to Republicans. Absolutely even. On the top of that, politics by cohort. And you can see how much the red grows as the years go on. When I was a kid, we had a kid like 22. I had a mug that said, "Don't trust anyone over 30." Now the mug is, "Don't trust anyone under 30." But the right is especially interesting. This column here is about variation by priorities. And you can see that the blue, the people, the good guys ordained before 1980, where their priorities are poverty, racism, social justice. And they're along with Francis on synodality. If you do the other extreme, 2000 and afterwards, you can see the priorities. Very weak on climate change. Still with immigration and refugees. That's a plus. Poverty and homelessness, still important. But look at Eucharistic devotion. Is very high, spikes. Access traditional Latin Mass. It's the highest with that cohort group. Now, I don't think Eucharistic adoration and social justice have to be competing. If you have the right kind of Eucharistic piety, you believe that Eucharist is about God sharing, and we're supposed to share ourselves with others. That came up in one of the prayers. But in fact, often Eucharistic adoration and Latin Mass go with very individualistic piety. It kind of sees theology or faith as the stairway to heaven. Back to that issue that Tom brought up. So what are we supposed to do? I should really start here, but I have much more to say about what's wrong than what I can say that we should do. But polarization divides the world into good people like us and bad people like them. You like that one? This is fundamentally offensive to the gospel. And we must resist the temptation. I feel it in myself. I'm sure you feel it in yourself. That we have to resist this temptation to create good people, bad people. Because that destroys solidarity, it destroys love. A lot of families are split because of the Trump thing. They can't talk to each other, and they refuse to talk to each other. And have split permanently. Very sad. So I think one thing we have to do is recognize our many similarities to the people we disagree with about these issues. We are part of the same human family and equally loved by God. And keep in mind that Jesus especially detested self-righteousness. And it's very easy because the evil here is so palpable. It's so obvious. So I think we have to have always in mind the bedrock moral conviction that every person is sacred. And that our task is to always look for the good in people from whom we are tempted to feel alienated. There is good in every human being. And the people that support the Trump administration in very large numbers, who feel left out, who feel they're completely stuck, who feel looked down upon by the elites and left out by economic globalization, are not wrong. A lot of people feel contempt for the working class, for low-income people. So we have to make sure, always, to remember we're all part of the same human family, and to have empathy for people, even if their political views for us are radically different. Even if their moral views are radically different. I think to do this is not an individual task, that we need to create, sustain, and participate in communities of inclusive solidarity. I think the elephants can be this, and is this. I think you can have parish study groups. I think you can get involved in popular local movements to try to do something practical. So getting actively involved in some concrete local project that works against the policies and practices we find objectionable. More importantly, working for policies and practices that we think are just. It's not just the negative, it's the positive we have to stress. I find one great outlet for this is faith-based community organizing, like you used to have the Detroit Regional Interfaith Voice for Equity. I just found from Bill O'Brien that that's now defunct. But there are other movements like that in parishes that can be cells of support and encouragement, because times are very discouraging right now. So we must struggle against the institutions and policies while always treating our opponents with respect and compassion and never regarding them as implacable enemies. And we need to continue to cultivate lives of faith, hope, and charity, and especially to be hopeful. Hope is a virtue, and virtues are not easy. Anybody can be shallowly optimistic. Hope is a theological virtue that says we believe grace ultimately will overcome sin and that the light will never be overcome by the darkness. Thank you very much.